When it comes to national celebrations, you can be sure that there will be music. Think back to jubilees, coronations, or the Olympics. Music at these events bind us to our national identity and invite us to remember together the core stories about who we are and where we stand in the world. Perhaps you've even had the chance to contribute to some of these events in the last few years. Well, if you were walking around ancient Israel in the heyday of King David, it wouldn't take long before music filled your ears. Making music was intrinsic to being God's chosen people, representatives for him to the nations. David had been crowned after the disappointing rule of Saul, who had neglected to worship God in God's way. David resolved that Israel needed to get back to their core story as God's people. They should worship God correctly and keep him at the centre of everything. In 1 Chronicles chapter 15, we find David doing just that. He throws a huge national party as he sets about bringing the Ark of the Covenant, which had been the marker of God's presence, into the very heart of Jerusalem, the nation's capital. It was an overwhelmingly joyful scene. But David, a composer and shepherd by trade, knew that there was an important element that was needed to help shape the Israelites' national identity as God's people. It was music. But who was to lead it? Well, in verse 16, we read that David commanded the chiefs of the Levites, the priestly clan, to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals to raise sounds of joy. The priests were used to being mini mediators between the people and God. They were constantly making sacrifices to Yahweh on Israel's behalf. But now David expands their role to include something new. As the priests led Israel in raising up a beautiful sound, everyone in Israel would be reminded of who they were made to be. For a moment, their music would be like a bridge between heaven and earth, taking them back to the Garden of Eden, where humans had once been unspoiled image bearers in uninterrupted communion with their Maker. This was God's people's true national identity. And David made sure that this was not some thrown together sort of event. No, he wanted to offer up the finest sounds to God's ears. We're told in verse 22 of chapter 15 that the whole event was conducted by a priest named Kenaniah, who was to lead because he was skillful. This was one of the few really high points in Israel's history. We shouldn't be surprised to find jubilant music jumping off the page at us. But what's interesting is that 1 Chronicles was originally written to a heartbroken people who had returned home after exile. They desperately needed to keep remembering who they were and what it looked like to worship God's way. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find the people looking back at this during their national religious celebrations and replicating it. They still needed to be led to rightly worship God, and music was again employed to guide them. For God's people today, music is still essential to remembering what our core story and identity is. But for us today, that's primarily as those in God's kingdom, rather than merely our national identity. We may still, of course, have opportunities to make joyful music for moments of national celebration. But much more excitingly, we get to use our musical gifts to remember and remind others of who we are in Christ as we come to sing and make music together as God's chosen people, week by week, in praise of him who alone is worthy.